Well, welcome to week 11 of RELS 357W, and this is on the theme for these 2 weeks of global climate change and the Anthropocene. And I want to look at those two definitions first and then go into a specific talk that I'll revise for this particular lecture today. So first of all, I want to just be sure that we have a good definition of global climate change. And here's one I've adapted from NASA's page, which you can see. Global climate change is a long-term change in the average weather patterns that have come to define Earth's local, regional, and global climates. And as you listen to the various podcasts and as you read various documents for these 2 weeks, and probably from what you've read in your own, you'll know that one of the key things for global climate change is a general warming. If you average the Earth's temperatures, more extreme weather patterns, and that's due to human-based emissions into the atmosphere, especially CO2 emissions. So the Anthropocene is the current geological age viewed as a period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on the climate and the environment. So you can see the other ages in this, the Jurassic area, which we know about from the famous movie, the Miocene, etc. And this is a new geological age, not in my reading entirely finalized as definitive, but saying that we have created as human beings, because of our global emissions, the potential for something drastically different in our Earth's climate. And I think that's, we might be causing our own death as a species as a result of that. As far as a Homo species, in other words, a species from the genus Homo, we are definitely not on course to be the longest lived or longest lived. By the way, I understand you're supposed to pronounce it longest lived, but longest lived just sounds so much more normal. Homo erectus lived, if my numbers are correct, I'm doing this from my head at the moment, 2.6 million years, and Homo sapiens definitely have not been around that long. All right, to the topic of today. Are we too heavenly minded, or should we say, are many Americans too heavenly minded to be of earthly good? This is religious views on sustainability. And again, I'm adapting it from my talk I gave at Chico State's March 2020 Sustainability Conference. So here is that talk. There's a growing sense of a coming end times and a resurgent fear that we as human beings are facing an apocalypse. In this lecture, in this talk today, I begin by outlining millenarian apocalyptic traditions in the United States, many of which are vulnerable to the criticism that they are being, as Oliver Wendell Holmes once quipped, heavenly minded, but of no earthly good. And then I'm going to compare this thinking with other views about the end of our days, such as contemporary climate change discourse, the practice and teachings of natural religions, also often called Neo-paganism, and creation care as an emphasis in contemporary Christianity. So, and then that's the way of closing this particular presentation with concerns for combating climate change with these more broadly spiritual practices and traditional religious practices. So that's a kind of wrap up. I'm not sure actually I'll close with that, but you'll see that in each of the sections probably more clearly. So many of these millenarian apocalyptic traditions seem so much about heaven that it's not really that important whether they concern themselves with the earth. And this, by the way, is not just an approach that's vulnerable, that Christian millenarian apocalyptic traditions are vulnerable to, but we'll keep it there because that's such a part of our country as we've been studying in this class. So a few days ago, I read the New York Times that Rodney Howard Brown of the River at Tampa Bay Church in Florida mocked people concerned about the disease of the coronavirus as pansies and insisted that he would only shutter the doors to his packed church, quote, when the rapture is taking place, end of quote. Now, I mentioned that in this class, you'll particularly be able to know about the rapture, since we've been studying that, the asserted effect of believers being pulled from this planet based on a reading of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17. So, as you well know, but it's worth repeating, the millenarian apocalyptic traditions have been really important in our country, and still in our country, about 70 to 80% of people say that they are Christians. Now, of course, not all Christians are from these traditions. Broadly speaking, these kind of traditions are a sizable minority, but still a minority even of Christians in our country. So, at any rate, what about climate change and those Christians that are apocalyptic in their views? So these next slides I'll do pretty quickly, since these are going to be review for this class. So apocalyptic, as you know, is relating to the apocalypse and drawing from the Boyer book, which we've read. It's a revelation mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality, which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial, insofar as it involves another supernatural world. So, as we've seen, apocalyptic thought arises in times of persecution, like under Antiochus Epiphanes around 167 before the Common Era for the Jews, in the first century of the Common Era for the Jews in which Jesus was doing his teaching, in the United States when we're concerned about the atomic bomb, or maybe now with the outbreak of the coronavirus, that the apocalyptic thinking has this sense that, especially if we're being persecuted, or if there are religious people that are being persecuted, that there's a vision that God will win in the end, despite how bad it looks on this earth. So you know these key terms. Millenarian is a movement that emphasizes teaching about or belief in the future. Eschatological is a type of theological teaching concerned with death, the final judgment, the final destiny of the world and humankind, and then this interpretive system called dispensationalism. I think I cut out of the screen the rapture, but it's the transporting of believers to heaven at the second coming of Christ. All right, so we've got Paul Boyer's book, a couple of quotes that you would know about it, that dispensational premillennialism, this specific belief system, has played an important role in shaping public opinions on a wide range of topics, and you've just done papers on this, but the Soviet Union, the common market, the Mideast, etc. And that interest has fluctuated, but when there's been uncertainty, upheaval, and danger, that kind of thinking has arisen. You all well know what premillennialism is. The doctrine that the prophesied 1,000 years of blessedness, or millennium, will begin with an imminent second coming of Jesus the Christ. And we're going to be studying in the next couple weeks is not how this has appeared just for Christian millennialists, but also for like the Mayan prophecy in 2012, for the Y2K experience in year 2000. And again, as we engage and live in this coronavirus time, that could be another time for apocalyptic thinking and even premillennial thinking. So from my book called Negotiating Science and Religion in America, I outline these three different positions. And here's the takeaway. Postmillennialism usually correlates with optimism in human actions, premillennialism with pessimism, so that many contemporary end times Christian proclamation is pessimistic and premillennial. And you know these three key New Testament passages, which I won't read, but Mark chapter 13, especially verses 26 through 27, the 24th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, the 21st chapter of the Gospel of Luke. I've already mentioned the letter of Paul to the Thessalonians, the first one, chapter 4, verse 17, and then, of course, Revelation 20, verse 6, for the particular prophecy. This is the only place it occurs, of the 1,000-year reign. And as we've studied, there aren't only, apocalyptic millennial voices in Christianity, but C.S. Lewis, like others, other Christians like C.S. Lewis, have a more mainline approach, a little bit more reasonable and less apocalyptic. And he says that we've never really known when Jesus is going to return if we confess that as Christians. In fact, the Christians need to stay prepared and simply do what Jesus teaches. Lewis writes it this way: we cannot always be excited. We can perhaps train ourselves to ask more and more often how the thing which we are saying or doing, or failing to do at each moment, will look when the irresistible light streams in upon it. That light which is so different from the light of this world, and yet even now we know just enough of it to take it into account. So I put that in there just to say there aren't only premillennial apocalyptic voices in Christianity. I want to shift gears now, and this is a little bit more about where we're moving to, that there are other voices that are secular, but they sound religious and apocalyptic. In much of contemporary climate change discourse, there's a sound of apocalyptic and quasi-religious tone and language. Hannah Malcolm for the Theos think tank wrote in 2018, the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change report confirms we are indeed living at the end of the world as we know it. And that phrase, the end of the world as we know it, could come directly from apocalyptic literature. Jonathan Franzen, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, from the New Yorker wrote this in 2019, quote, other kinds of apocalypse, whether religious or thermonuclear or asteroidal, at least have the binary neatness of dying one moment the world is there, the next it's gone forever. So what he's saying here is there's this distinction. That's ending his quote now for a minute. He's saying there's this distinction when there were formerly apocalypses, was like there's a world, boom, there's no world, especially with like an atomic bomb or an asteroid hitting us. Okay, he continues. Climate apocalypse, by contrast, is messy. It will take the form of increasingly severe crises, especially weather crises, compounding chaotically until civilization begins to fray. Things will get very bad, but maybe not too soon, and maybe not for everyone. Maybe not for me. End of quote. So what he's bringing out is there's still this kind of apocalypse, these sort of two worlds, the end of the world we're in, but not all of us feel like we may be people who will be part of those changes with climate change, and particularly the negative sides of it. And I certainly recognize that for the generation of college students, there's anger at older generations like mine that we have allowed this to occur, and I think we're guilty of that. But also, some people just become, complacent. They're like, well, I don't live, in the Maldives or in the Marshall Islands, so if water rises, I'm in Chico, 300 or so feet of elevation, so it's not probably going to flood me. You know what I mean? So there is that when water rises. So that's the kind of thinking that goes on. Now, here's my concern. These pick up the tradition of American apocalyptic thought, and they secularize it. That's at least what it sounds like. It concerns me because those outside of this kind of language tend to stay outside when apocalyptic discourse is applied unnecessarily. So one of the things I've seen with people is if they don't subscribe to climate change, or they hear the more crazy, in my opinion, more crazy approaches to climate change, like, in 2 years everything's going to be terrible, or whatever unique time frame there is, really short time frame, and then it doesn't happen, the kind of apocalyptic language, I think, distances people who aren't convinced, and it also makes it harder to believe in if some of the more extreme versions, which tend to often correlate with this apocalyptic language, if those aren't met, if those timetables not met. And that's true in religion and in this more secular kind of apocalyptic thinking. At least that's my opinion. So I want to talk then, next point, about earth-based religions, paganism, or neo-paganism. So this comes from some slides in a lecture presented by Sarah Pike from Comparative Religion and Humanities. And I want to be very clear from the beginning that paganism and neo-paganism are not negative terms, they're descriptive terms. I think a lot of people who have had religious training would see it just as, oh, you're a pagan, meaning you're immoral or, I don't know, whatever else. But neo-paganism in this sense is just an umbrella term for modern revivals, that's the neo part, of ancient earth-based religions and magical traditions. Magical means you do certain things with natural elements, and they produce effects elsewhere within nature. That's what magic is, not, making the rabbit appear out of the hat or something. So these neo-pagan traditions, religious traditions, can be polytheistic, pantheistic, or monotheistic, and some of their subdivisions are Wicca or witchcraft, Azustra, and Druidism. I'm just going to put out here some of the symbols for you from Slavic neo-paganism, Germanic neo-paganism, Hellenic Reconstructionism, neo-pagan pentagram, Wicca, etc., etc. Just interesting to see some of these symbols. And then also to see how so often, because neo-paganism is and these nature-based religions are related to nature, they often, what we would call worship, happens within the natural world. And you can see a couple of these altars in nature. So here's Azustra, a religion which believes in the ancient Germanic spirits and gods. It was officially recreated in the 1970s in Iceland, but its roots may go back many thousands of years. It means faith in the Azir, or the Germanic gods. And these are people loyal to 9 noble virtues. And I just underline that if neo-paganism is thought often as a negative, it would be hard for many of us to disagree with these virtues: courage, truth, honor, loyalty, self-discipline, hospitality, industriousness, self-reliance, and steadfastness. So again, just to review a quick definition of neo-paganism: a modern religious movement which seeks to incorporate beliefs and practices from traditions outside the main world religions, especially those of pre-Christian Europe and North America. So that's why pagan sometimes is used to simply mean religious traditions outside the main world religions, which isn't as helpful. I want to focus on really its more content-oriented meaning of about nature. So in neo-paganism, the divine is immanent, living beings are interconnected, and here's the point for what we're talking about right now. So often there's a closer relationship with the earth and caring for the earth because the earth is sacred. So many people that I run into in contemporary science and religion work or religious studies work say, well, if we just got back to neo-paganism or nature religions, we wouldn't have the problems we're having with global climate change, etc. So witchcraft or Wicca, this is another one of these neo-pagan movements, is a pagan movement of the 20th century influenced by pre-Christian beliefs and practices of Europe, Western Europe, affirming the existence of supernatural power. I mentioned magic in this way. How charms, those are magic, those are natural things that then cause, love or hate or, revenge or whatever. And Wicca or witchcraft has both male and female deities that are inherent in nature and observes the ritual observance of seasonal and life cycles. So often Wicca can be duotheistic with a god and a goddess. So you see here the wheel of the year, the 8 holy days, Yule being around the time of Christmas. We are currently around of Ostara, which is, we think of Easter, the summer solstice, and you can read the rest there. Another one of these traditions is Druidism, Stonehenge being probably a Druid temple, Stonehenge in England. Druidism is a modern religious movement that has its general principles in the promotion of harmony, connection, reverence for the natural world. So that's what's so important in relationship to caring for the earth, global climate change, etc. It also wants the respect for all things. So a lot of times in neo-paganism, this idea that there's God who's different from and sometimes understood to be separate from the world, and then human beings being unique, and from the Jewish and Christian texts and similar texts in Islam, that we are created uniquely and in the image of God. Here there's a much closer connection between and really a continuity of the divine or the sacred within all living things, and human beings being part of a much more lateral or even relationship with the rest of nature. So Druid, from the Celtic meaning knowing or finding the oak tree, was a member of the learned class among the ancient Celts. They seem to have frequented oak trees and acted as priests, teachers, and judges. And the earliest known records of Druids are from the 3rd century before the Common Era. So they have 5 elements of nature, and you can see here a table celebrating those, a kind of altar, but it's a card table, very and right next to a cat box as I look at this picture. It's just right in the middle of somebody's house. Earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. And interestingly, 5 directions, not just 4: north, east, southwest, and center. Center as well. The Wk11, I believe that's how it's pronounced, is a statement that sets out a key moral system in the Neo-paganism, and particularly Wicca or witchcraft. And it harm none, do what ye will, blessed be to thee. And you can see another version of that. May the air teach you, may the earth be a foundation for you, may the fire drive you, may the water cleanse you. Some final points. So we've looked at how there's the millenarian apocalyptic tradition. We already saw that. How that tradition sometimes gets secularized in contemporary climate change discussions or discourse. And then this foray into another kind of religious tradition, which is not represented in the apocalyptic American world, almost never. I mean, I'm not saying there's never apocalyptic traditions within neo-paganism, but generally not, and this importance of this connection with nature. So back to the question. Does religion lead one to be, quote, heavenly minded but of no earthly good, as Oliver Wendell Holmes quipped? And it depends on the religion, it seems like. And religions that really see this world as needing to be destroyed seem to connect more closely with a lack of concern for the earth. But we wouldn't want to put all of Christianity into that, or Judaism, or Islam for that matter. To the right, you can see in this graph the total Americans on from 2015 from this particular survey that Yale University does on views of climate change. And by the way, you'll hear about that in the podcast for this week. Majorities of American Catholics and non-evangelicals think global warming is happening. So Catholics are slightly higher than the total Americans pool. 69% believe it is happening or believed in 2015. Total Americans is 63%. Protestants who are not evangelicals are about that same percentage. It's evangelicals, meaning the more biblically conservative, those who emphasize a personal salvation in Jesus Christ, and also those who are more likely to subscribe to apocalyptic and millenarian perspectives. Again, not entirely, these are correlations, but often. And so they tend to be less convinced of global climate change. Finally, then, I want to say that there are other views about the end of our days, and not all is lost with traditional religion and climate change. So in much of the contemporary Christianity that I hear about, there's this emphasis on creation care. So I have 3 points to that. In general, younger conservative and also liberal Christians tend to emphasize creation care or response to climate change, you could add there, as an idea of stewardship and as a part of the responsive Christian faith. So we don't want to make all Christians bad or climate change deniers, and there's definitely a skewing, excuse me, a skewing toward younger Christians subscribing to that. There was in 2015 the National Association of Evangelicals. Leith Anderson, the president, stated this, quote, "The Bible commands us to care for God's earth and the people in it. This resolution is about joining with our brothers and sisters around the world to fulfill that mandate." End of quote. So that's National Association of Evangelicals. So it's not all evangelicals that are against caring for the earth and concerning themselves with climate change. I happened to speak at a conference that NAE put together with Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion as a part of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and heard Leith Anderson speak, and I actually was part of a panel. And the point being, I heard, with my own ears and participated in a conference with evangelicals who were interested in climate change. And I myself am a practicing Christian and part of Christians who want to care for creation and fully subscribe to the science that demonstrates that the climate is changing and that human activity is responsible for it. So I have a particular nonprofit that I co-direct called Science for the Church that seeks to bring. Let's try this again. Science for the Church, which is scienceforthechurch.org. It seeks to bring mainstream science to Christian congregations or churches, and we just got a grant from the Bradshaw Knight Foundation for climate change education in churches. Let me just tell you a little reason why I'm concerned about that and how it relates to this topic. So as I said, most Americans are Christians. Most Christians are connected with a church. Our country, for its own sake, needs to engage with science because science and technology are critical for our society. You can see how important it is with the outbreak of the coronavirus and the disease COVID-19. And so in seeing this resistance to science in churches, I've created this nonprofit with a colleague to help educate churches for how to engage science and make positive change. And one of those particular components has been with climate change education, but also more recently with the COVID-19 outbreak. So just to summarize, not all is lost with traditional religion, and yet we can see that the traditional religious views that emphasize the apocalyptic often are resistant to caring for our climate. Interestingly, point two, many contemporary secular versions of climate change use religious language, which I think is a mistake. I think it's not a good rhetorical strategy, but there it is. And then thirdly, just to present, is it all religion that does this? Well, it seems like Neo-pagan and nature religions, which bring, or many of people have said, nature religions bring a much closer relationship with care for the earth right into the center of the religious practice, and there are some of those examples which I gave you. So there you have it, and it will be interesting as we continue these topics of moving beyond the particularly millenarian and apocalyptic traditions, how these view the end of the world.